guys, so we are in a different setting today. We have an exciting video. Our team yesterday, we went to the Global Fashion Agenda, or GFA's first ever Boston Summit, and fresh off the press, we're going to recap it. And I thought what better way than to bring Helen in as well. She's one of our team members. She went with me, and I thought it would be really helpful to get my perspective and her perspective and have a conversation around it. So basically, right off the bat, if you haven't heard of GFA before, or the Global Fashion Agenda, they're a nonprofit that's really working towards making a net positive fashion industry, which is really ambitious and really exciting. And they do a lot of great work. One of them is hosting these conferences, and yesterday was their first ever Boston Summit, or ever summit in the United States. Usually it's in Copenhagen. And so there was a lot of different items talked about in the conference, and we took a lot of notes, which is why we're going to be referencing them, because we want to make sure we give you the best of the best and just really remember everything we covered. So first of all, the theme of the conference was really great. They were talking a lot about ambition to action, because there's been a lot of talk around, sustainability is important. I think we can all agree on that now, but the time is kind of running out, time is ticking, so we need to really put things into action. So in this video, we'll provide our thoughts, like I said, deep dive into interesting topics and panels that was discussed. So in particular, we're going to talk about the EU and US policy updates, which I think everyone's excited about. There's a lot of legislation coming down the pipeline. I've referenced it on the podcast in our YouTube videos before. There's an update we're going to talk about. Helen's going to talk about AI, and then we're going to talk about resale's role and decarbonizing fashion. We're going to talk about circularity and then indigenous learnings as well. And then, we'll kind of summarize everything too. The one thing I am excited about is sometimes with conferences like this, they can kind of start high level, or kind of the discussion can be up here, and then there's not a lot about what you can do. And these conferences are so good at motivating you and making you passionate, or reinvigorating your passion, which I'll talk about, but then they don't really give you action items, so you're kind of left with like, okay, I feel depressed or I feel empowered, but what do I do with these feelings? So we're going to try our hardest to give you action items, whether you're like a brand owner or just a regular consumer, and then that way you can feel empowered to do something. Let's begin with our thoughts overall on the conference. And Helen, do you want to start?
Absolutely, and thank you, Selina, for inviting me to come up to Boston. It's been such a great experience, and I'm very excited to discuss what we learned yesterday. And I think first I need to say that this was my first ever GFA conference. I was really impressed initially too with just the level of diversity in different nationalities and people wearing just different clothing styles, and also the languages that were being spoken, and you got to also see people from all different parts of the industry and adjacent to the industry. So it really just gave, especially for me who's relatively new to the industry, just a really high level kind of overview of how complex the fashion industry really is and how global it truly is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think also too, just impressed with the high level of the production quality. And you can get a sense of this too if you follow GFA on Instagram, which you definitely should. And their team really just goes all out to create an incredible event. The video, the music, just the amazing food, all of this stuff, but that also, the production quality does not, I think, obfuscate the fact that we're all there to talk about very serious issues. And so that is also, I think, important to point out. And and I thought honestly it was going to be kind of overwhelming and draining, but I actually found it really energizing. So and I think some quotes that really resonated with me throughout my time yesterday was this idea that we have kind of severed production from consumption at this stage in capitalism, if you will. We've severed production from consumption and also disposability from consumption. And it kind of points to how I think both for consumers but also for brands, just how much of fashion scope is kind of hidden and obfuscated. And that quote just really resonated with me. And another stat, if you will, that resonated with me and has kind of stuck itself in my brain is from this panel on climate mitigation, and talking about the effect that climate events, particularly high heat and flooding, will have in major production centers. This was referencing a report that Cornell co-authored, and one of the statistics was that in 2030, Karachi in Pakistan is probably going to experience 190 days of extreme heat, which is very scary, and it really sort of puts into like a human perspective too, because just the effects that high heat have on one's body and just all of the things like what that means for people working in factories as well as brands, and just really sort of, I think for me, put like a real human element to like what can seem kind of abstract, you know, and vague. So that is something that has kind of really stuck in my brain, and I can't get it out of my head. So and those are sort of the main things. And what did you think, Selina?
Yeah, no, I just briefly wanted to talk about some of the things you discussed because it's all really important stuff. First of all, with like the 190 days of heat, it's such a powerful number, but then also they're not the only areas of the world that are going to experience this. And there's already so much climate displacement and migration, and it's just going to continue, which is why, again, I think the theme of the conference being ambition to action is so important, because if we don't start acting and we don't start acting faster, this is just going to continue to escalate. And we're in very privileged positions if we live in like Canada, America, or Europe, or Australia, or wherever, where we see about this on the news, and that's like our only way of knowing about it, but otherwise we don't know. So it's important to go to conferences like this, hear different perspectives, hear lived experiences, and be able to see it, so that it's like, yes, the work we're doing is important, and it is really crucial that we speed it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have like really similar thoughts to you. I mean, first of all, the food at this conference is so good. We were like talking about how good the food is. And usually at conferences like this, the food is trash, but no, the food is really good, so we appreciated that. So the first thing I will say off the bat is that I'm really glad I carved out the time to attend. I know that sometimes it can be really hard to set aside time to go to conferences and set aside time to travel too. So I'm just really glad I was able to carve that out for myself, because coming out of it, I think it really reinvigorated my passion for the work we're doing. And because I've been doing it for a while, it's not that I'm not passionate about it, but I think I just like sometimes forget the bigger why, which is why I always talk about like why it's so important to have your why. But it also was helpful because I got to see all the people at the conference and just see the amount of work that's being done and the amount of people that also care about this and is also working on this alongside with us. It's like not just us, it's not just our clients and not just our community, but all these other businesses too, which was really cool to see. So I think that really reinvigorated like the passion, but also a hopefulness that honestly I think I've lost a little bit. Like we were talking a little bit about how sometimes I feel a bit jaded now, but I think that really reinvigorated me, which is really nice. We talked about it a little bit already. Like we've seen the effects of climate change, and there's so many like 2025, 2030, 2050 goals, and we're like pretty much almost there. Like it's going to be 2024 soon, which is crazy. And so the time for discussing if sustainability is important or crucial is long gone, and we need to act faster. And then there's still a lot of issues present in the industry. We were kind of talking about yesterday how it's almost like it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet with like all the things that are wrong with the industry. Just pick anything and you can work on it. But I've been to Copenhagen last year. I did a podcast recap on it. We can like leave it down below. But some of the things that were discussed that were still kind of problems there are still problems now. Like supply chain is continuously not great, and I think that the conference does a good job of bringing about different people in the supply chain, and continuously they've just like continued to get the short end of the stick. They feel the impacts and they feel frustrated, and honestly if brands wanted to do better they would, and it's just very frustrating because a lot of these suppliers, and when I talk about suppliers I mean like, you know, manufacturers and other suppliers, but a lot of them, they just don't have the leverage or negotiating power, because if they tell a brand like, no, we need more time, or no, we need to increase prices, like the brand can just pick up and move to another production facility, so they don't have a lot of leverage. And then data and measurement continues to be something that's challenging, and you know, it's being worked on, but it's still something that's very prevalent in the industry. And then last but not least, I was really, really impressed with some of the innovations, and we're actually going to have some of those businesses and founders on the podcast because I think a lot of them are doing great work and I would love to amplify it and share with all of you. But one of them is a material company, which I'm hoping to get on the pod, but basically they take fish nets and they break them down, and that's not a new thing, but the process in which they do that is very much so quite innovative. They break it down mechanically using machinery versus chemicals. And a lot of companies now are breaking it down with chemicals, which is, you're kind of left with what you can do, and they try to do it closed loop so the chemicals get reused and continue to stay and they don't leach out into waterways and stuff. But if we can do it mechanically, that's amazing. So yeah, just like a lot of really cool innovations and people that I'm hoping to have on the podcast. And then to end my really long preamble that was supposed to be short, a couple quotes. So there was a lot of like stats and things that came up for every single panel, but the two quotes that really resonated with me are as follows. So the first one is, we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. And I think that is just very clear. Like, lots of pieces of sustainability are nuanced and gray, but this is very black and white. You're either helping or you're not, and there's just no in between at this point. And then the second quote that really resonated with me is, how do we make fast fashion as gross and unappealing as smoking? Which is something that like really got me thinking. So yeah, I think this is all really great, and we're gonna dive a little bit deeper now. But before we do, I just wanted to say, if you aren't already part of our community, which is called the Sustainable Fashionpreneurs, or TSF, you need to join, because we're going to take this discussion, almost like this debate, and take it to the next level with you guys. So in the community, we would love to hear your thoughts. If there's certain things that we talk about in this video that you want us to go deeper on, or guests you want on the podcast, then make sure you join the community. It's absolutely free. There's a bunch of resources in there. There's a masterclass. I do live workshops. We talk about all our videos and podcasts in there, so make sure you join. The link is recloseted.com/TSF. It's going to be on the screen. It's going to be in the show notes. But yeah, make sure you join, because it's going to be hopefully a really good discussion. I want to have this be like a two-sided conversation, basically. Yeah. Anything to add before we go into policy?
Oh my gosh, I had a couple of thoughts, so I'm trying to collect them. Yeah, I think something too that, because I've been in fashion like kind of on the periphery, like as a working as a stylist, not like so much like on the production and
not like on the behind the scenes
side. Yeah, and I think something too that was brought up multiple times yesterday in different ways is that brands still have a hard time understanding even like how their things are being made and under what conditions, and again like with like the obfuscating of the supply chain and all that stuff. And I think also, again, you're mentioning of shifting kind of perspectives of like, how do we make sustainability or like secondhand like more normalized? I think I'm thinking about the Indigenous panel that we'll get to later, this idea of, if you find sustainability like overwhelming, maybe reframing it and thinking of it in terms of circularity and making it more, because I think sometimes we use these terms that can seem kind of like just too broad and fuzzy, and making it more personalized I think is more helpful, because it's more concrete and easier to act upon.
Yeah, it's more meaningful, right? Yeah. Like for any word in general, it's like, what does this mean to me? And I think it's important to define words before we use them, especially buzzwords like sustainability, like circularity.
Which is also a complicated thing like ESG. Like
totally.
There was a whole panel on discussing. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, there's so much.
Yeah.
Let's talk about policy. Lots of people are really excited about policy legislation. This discussion is going to be centered around US policy, because that's just what was talked about at this conference, because we're in Boston. As a lot of you may know, there's a lot of legislation coming down the pipeline in the EU, which is very exciting, very needed, very long overdue. And then as such, there's been a lot of media and eyes on that, because it's so exciting. Fashion is not a very regulated industry, which is insane. I often talk about how for our clothes, we wear them for hours and hours on our skin every single day. Everyone wears clothes, and yet it's not really regulated. And for industries like food, it's so heavily regulated, which makes sense, and it should be, but fashion should be as well, so it's very long overdue. And because there's so much EU legislation going on and eyeballs on it, sometimes other countries can be seen as not have done very much work yet, and US is doing work, but it can be seen, or like it has been seen as they're like lagging behind, basically.
That's the narrative.
Yeah, that's the narrative right now. And And I think the key message I took away was that there is a lot of action happening. Yeah, so there's a few things. I will talk about kind of what was covered on the panel that stuck out to me. The first one is that they are trying to bring forth a digital product passports, which is not a new thing. So basically the idea is you as a consumer are going to be able to scan a garment. It could be a QR code, it could be something else. And then on your phone or on any device you choose, it will pop up about what the product is. So you can see like not only the composition of fabric, but like where it's from, maybe like a cool video or photos of the production facility. And then just like, it's like a landing page basically for your garment, and it's like having the tag come to life.
Yeah, we also saw that at the Innovation Forum.
That's something that they really want to pass, and one of the panelists said something that was really inspiring. She was like, we're really trying to make labels obsolete and move completely to this, so that as clothes are continued to be like resold or rented, like if the tag comes off or you lose it, no big deal, there's still this digital product passport following it. And then the funny kind of thing was like, they were like, the FTC in the US needs to approve this, but they were like, yeah, but the FTC is too busy suing Amazon right now, so that was like that. So that was like the first thing. And then the second thing is I appreciate how difficult creating policy and regulation and legislation can be. I think there was a lot of vulnerability and candidness on the panel, because a lot of them were like, yeah, I don't even know if we have the right people in the room right now doing this. I think perspectives and voices are not being heard, but there's a lot of pressure to get something out the door. And so, yeah, I got the sense that there's a lot of pressure to put something together because the EU is acting quite quickly, and the EU has had like 5+ years to neutrally think through the scope, which is amazing. Like, they've involved a lot of different stakeholders. They've involved brand owners, they've involved nonprofits, suppliers, and so they've had a lot of time to talk about this without it being like too political. So that's been helpful, but the US hasn't had that, so now they have to like act fast and put something together. And someone on the panel said that like they're very much so in a move fast, break things kind of stage. As a person that's like very organized and type A, and also as someone that's like cares very deeply about this, it was like slightly concerning, I'm not gonna lie, to like hear them admit that they don't think they have the right people in the room and they're being pushed to like push something out. And then the other thing that was concerning too was someone on the panel quite candidly said that if they push out bad policy, at the worst, there could be really detrimental consequences on a brand level, on a supplier level, on a textile waste level, just like on so many levels. And then at the best, if they push out bad policy, it could just not do what we want it to do. So let that sink in. Like, they don't have the right people in the room, they're being forced to do something, and they're like, oh yeah, at worst it could have detrimental consequences, and at the best it just like doesn't do what we want it to do, and brands like find loopholes and they don't act in accordance that we want them to do. So this is not just for this scenario, this is for policy in general, right? Like, if you create a law for anything or a bill for anything, like, you need to have the right people in the room and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's never going to be a clean process. They always said like democracy is messy, and that's like part of what a democracy and a democratic process involves. But yeah, that was like interesting to me. And I feel concerned, but I also have trust that they'll like figure it out.
Full disclosure, I was not at this panel. We
yeah.
kind of had to triage it, so I went to the AI one, and you went to this policy one. So
it really sucked they were at the same time, because
Yeah.
both of them were really juicy topics, so we had to like divide and conquer. But yeah, that was that. And then the last thing that really stood out to me is one of the panelists said that fashion has always been marketed and seen as being fun and frivolous. And in many ways it can be, right? Like, fashion's a way to express yourself, to be creative. It can sometimes like very much so be an art form. And so in that regard, it can come across as like fun, silly, frivolous, whatever. But we need to stop talking about it like it is. Yes, it is fun, and yes, it's glamorous and all this stuff, but at the same time, there's very real impacts that are being had with people that like make these clothing, with their environment, with the planet. There's very real impacts, and we need to start taking this seriously. And she was saying one of the consequences of having fashion being portrayed in such a manner is that policymakers and lawyers, who are very kind of like serious people, don't take this seriously, and we're just not getting the expertise that we need in this field to make good policy, unfortunately. And hopefully that changes. Like, I think there's a lot of great work being done, and a lot of the panelists, it seemed like they were kind of hinting at the fact that they're not really getting paid that much to do it, slash it might even be like off the side of their desk, like volunteer work. So I really hope that it gets the attention and the funding and the resources that it deserves. I mean, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, so as your friendly neighbor, I'm like, I hope you guys figure it out.
I also hope we figure it out.
Yeah, because also like Canada's gonna fast follow and do whatever America does, as we always do. So it's like, I hope you guys figure it out. That was kind of the real takeaway from the US perspective. Again, like I'm not going to dive into the EU stuff because this was very US focused, but I wanted to give you all an update because there's a lot of different stuff going around right now and it's a hot topic and a lot of people are interested about what's going on. So TLDR, things are happening fast. It may not be amazing from day one, but I think they're very much so in an iteration process.
Yeah, I think to sort of add, and again, I was not at this panel, so this is not based on what I heard, but based on what we talked about yesterday. I think in addition to fashion being kind of seen as frivolous, it's also been like feminized, which is seen as being less than, you know, so there's also like this sort of misogyny in those assumptions as well. And again, that kind of like obfuscates a lot of the real work and like the harm that is being done, you know, just so many layers.
Yeah. So with all that being said, you might feel a bit frustrated because especially if you live in the US and you're like, I want things to be done differently. I want brands to be held accountable. Like I just want to do something about it. Here's what you can do. These are a couple of our suggestions. So the first thing I would challenge you to do, no matter if you're a fashion consumer or a brand owner, just like everyone can do this, is to think about fashion differently. Yes, it can be fun, and yes, it can be creative, and yes, like a certain outfit can make you feel better than another one. But like you need to start to educate yourself and really increase your own awareness and psyche about the actual effects of our clothing and why it's so important. So we'll have some resources linked for you down below, and when you join TSF, there's like a whole sustainable fashion resource post that we have pinned. So there's like The True Cost, which is an amazing documentary, part of the reason why I started Recloseted in the first place. I also wrote the Recloseted handbook, so if you haven't checked it out yet, make sure you do so. But you need to start to educate yourself and think of fashion differently and encourage those around you to think about fashion differently too, because this is something that we need to start taking seriously because it is very serious business. And so, yeah, that was like my big takeaway. And then you also, I wanted to kind of ask you, because you're American.
Yeah.
And as much as like our democratic process in Canada is kind of similar, like it's also different. So I'll let you take away around like locally and like grassroots what you think people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say start paying attention to fashion related bills or even like fashion industry adjacent bills, either in your local government or obviously going up and before like Congress and Senate. I believe now there's like the Fabric Act that's being discussed and things like that. So really just start again to pay attention. Oftentimes you can go on like the Congress website and like look at reviews and things like that and read like actual text. And again, it's kind of legal and complicated. I think just start to pay attention to what is happening, again, specifically within fashion, but also in environmental sectors and like garment worker rights and like everything that is kind of, because fashion kind of sits at this intersection of different industries. Start paying attention, and also I think doing some internal work to figure out what is interesting to you about fashion and about these issues and kind of going deeper into that. I would hope at this point in US history that we're becoming more aware that local government is important, but paying attention to what's happening locally and really honestly calling your representatives and talking about these issues and that they're important to you, because people do pay attention to that, like not just like your congressperson, but also their staff do make note of the calls that they receive and about what issues, and it is being paid attention to. So really, you know, I know it's hard to get on the phone and like call a stranger, but it really can make a huge impact, and people do pay attention to that. So yeah, those would be the two main actions. Yeah, also like not being afraid to talk to other people in your community. I think we need to act both in your immediate area and then also think on a national level. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would also say vote.
That too, yes, of course.
Like, don't complain if things aren't happening
vote.
if you didn't vote.
Register to vote, please vote. 2024 is coming.
Yes.
Faster than we think.
Oh yeah.
Please vote.
As your friendly, concerned Canadian neighbor that's now living in London, please vote.
Yes.
Okay, that's a really good conversation, I think, about policy. And then, like we discussed, the policy and AI panel were unfortunately at the same time. So we divided and conquered. And so, Helen, do you want to talk through kind of what you learned at the AI panel and what some of the high-level overview and takeaways were?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that I'm not a technologist, so I did my best to understand what was being discussed here. But I think really there were sort of a few main points. Is really one of the elements was the potential for AI to create like more curated recommendations for people. So sort of AI, like there is like an element obviously of personalizing content for people already on digital platforms. So really sort of using AI to create even more kind of a dialed in version of those things, and basically using that system to potentially, you know, in showing people products that they would like and use and products that will fit their body. The idea is as you train different types of AI to basically do the work of a tailor or a stylist. So like begin to understand your body, what clothes could work for you, and also like what your sort of personal style is. The potential to use AI to do those things. And the idea is that that will help reduce potentially like retail returns, and in doing so potentially cut down on like emissions and stuff like that, because if you're buying something that's already sort of pre-selected for you to work, then you won't return it. So that was a potential thing that could happen with using AI. And then initially this was kind of floated as using AI to potentially reduce overconsumption, because you're showing people pieces that they're sort of predisposed to like already, and that will supposedly like work for them. I'm a little bit personally like, skeptical about this, because if we think of like what overconsumption actually is, I think in reality it's like not so much what you're buying, but it's the quantity and the frequency. So like if we have this sort of hyper curation of products that may not change the frequency because we're not changing the buying behavior necessarily. Like if, for instance, like if you're used to buying products like once a week or multiple times a week, I think that's not going to change just because you're seeing things that you're more likely, you know, that are more personalized.
So it actually might make it worse.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying. So for example, like what I have in the notes is like, just to use an example from a different industry, like if Netflix, which already offers like some personalization, if they go like hardcore on their algorithm and you log into Netflix and everything that you see, like all you see is personalized content, is that going to make you watch more TV? Probably not. You may watch, you know, it's not going to make you watch less TV. It'll probably make you watch more TV. So my thought is like, it may not reduce overconsumption. It may increase overconsumption, because it's not addressing the habit that we have of just basically buying too much, whether we need it.
It's solving the wrong problem.
Whether we need it or not. So I think to address like the overconsumption part, that's really sort of internal, like emotional and psychological work that we need to do, and AI can't really do that for us. So that's like my little critique with the AI panel. But I think so in addition, so we have three things. We have AI potentially mitigating like returns and cutting down on emissions. Then we have this maybe debatable idea of AI reducing overconsumption. The other way that AI could potentially help the fashion industry is like basically improving existing processes, like with, for example, I think the example was given of reducing waste on the cutting room, like factory floor and stuff like that. So pretty much improving existing like operations. And I think those are sort of like the three kind of main things.
Cool.
But do you have any thoughts? Because you know, I think a lot more about AI than I do. So.
I mean, I'm not like a techie person either, but there's a couple things. Like as you were talking about the piece on overconsumption, like I wanted to dive a little bit deeper there, because I agree it's like solving the wrong problem. If you're just getting more personalized things, you are going to buy more, let's be real, right? But instead, if you could also have like the AI could have an inventory of your wardrobe and what you have, and be like, actually, you know what, you already have something like this, why don't we like style it different ways, or you know, almost like a curated wardrobe thing. I think that would be better if we take it one step further, because how many times have we bought something and been like, oh my god, I have something like this at home, I just didn't realize, right? Like we need to start to solve the right problem. And then the other thing too, when you mentioned the design process. I think that's where a lot of AI stuff can be really exciting about like taking the fitting process, and typically like you have to hire like one type of model, one size, but like if you have a very size inclusive line, instead of doing that, maybe you could like fit it on this like AR retrofitted like metaversey, you know, robot thingy, and I don't have the correct terminology for it, but
I think robot thingy is technical.
Yeah, robot thingy. We're gonna trademark it. But yeah, like I think that can be really helpful. And then when you're creating the markers too, I think just having AI do it, or you know, just being more efficient with fabric, that can reduce a lot of waste. Yeah.
I think also going back to the panel, there were 3 panelists, and I think 2 or more sort of technology based, and the other panelist was from The Hague, and he was talking about too like the need in order to build really good AI, you need good data, and there's still, again, going back to the lack of clarity and transparency in the supply chain and the fashion industry. There's still like that fundamental issue, and so in order to like build these tools to assist in like these serious problems, we basically need better data.
Yeah.
Essentially. So
yeah, totally. So the kind of takeaways here. So I think the first one I talked about is like the fashion design process. I think when we talk about AI, metaverse, all these trendy techie things, a lot of it is still quite far in advance in terms of actually being commercially usable and viable. A lot of it is being developed right now, and developed at a very alarmingly fast rate, but that's like a topic for another time. But that being said, there is a lot of, I think, promise in the fashion design process. So keep an eye out for potentially things that could help your pattern maker be more efficient, or if you're a pattern maker, like help you be more efficient. And keep an eye out for things that could allow you to potentially reduce your textile waste on the cutting room floor, like we talked about. And then the other thing too is, I know there was a lot of hype around the metaverse and like fashion shows and things like that, and I feel like it died down a little bit, but it's still very much so true. Like if you can showcase your collection in a way where you don't need to have people fly in, and you don't need to have like huge venues and have such a big impact, and you just do it online and still have it be impactful, I think that could be really cool. And then the other one too is, if you are like, oh my god, this stuff is really going over my head and I don't really know what all of it means, how can I actually use it to better my business? I did talk about it on our Recloseted Radio podcast episode. It was episode 158, and it was called How Fashion Brands Can Leverage AI and ChatGPT. So we will leave it down below for you to check out if you want as well. Yeah, and then generally just like stay tuned.
Stay tuned, that's the CTA here.
Yeah. Okay, so the next panel that I wanted to talk about is resale's role in decarbonizing fashion. And resale is having a very big moment in the industry because it can be a very helpful tool to help brands decarbonize their impact. And there was a lot of really interesting things that were being said. I know it was one of your favorite panels too, so I'm excited to dive in. But first of all, they talked about how not everything needs to be designed for future vintage or for future resale or repurposing, such as like underwear, undershirts, socks. And they were like, that is totally fine because not everything can be. And it was nice to hear that, because I think a lot of the times people just assume that everything needs to be reworn. But for the pieces that can, which obviously are the majority, you do need to, of course, design intentionally, and that starts from the beginning, like at the design concept, and just like sourcing the materials, really thinking about timeless pieces, high quality pieces that last long. And so that is so important first and foremost. And they were saying that they did a bunch of different studies, and this is probably not surprising to you, but items hold their value best based on 2 things. The first one is brand. So brand carries a lot of things. If we look at like an Hermes Birkin bag, obviously that carries value and appreciates every single year. And the second thing is product quality as well. So if a product can continue to be worn and wear even maybe better over time, like a really good leather jacket or something, or like a really good vintage Levi's pair of jeans, then it holds its value. So it's all about, again, being intentional from the beginning. And I know you're really passionate about this. Did you have any thoughts around those topics?
Yeah, I mean, I was already kind of predisposed to like the subject, just because it goes back to like a lot of my personal like sort of fashion values, if you will. And what really struck me, and something that I hadn't fully thought about, was, well, it's also profitable for brands to invest in resale and design with either longevity in mind or designed with like the end of the cycle in mind when you're creating products. And that, because also the longer you make something to last, the more you can, you're not just theoretically selling it one time, you can sell it multiple times over and continue to make profit out of it. And you're also reducing climate impact because you're stretching out that life cycle. So it's just really like cool and fun to hear it talked about in that way. And I love the idea of future vintage. So totally here for that.
Totally, yeah. And just building upon Helen's point, so what she's talking about is a different business model. Like I've talked about it before, but right now in fashion, brands only make money when they first sell something. So they are incentivized to overproduce because the more they produce, the more they make. Unless, of course, they skyrocket their prices and it's like you sell less, but you make more. But still, in that model, you still have to sell new stuff. And so in this regard, if brands are now able to have something in circulation and continue to make money while it's being circulated, that can really help with the overproduction and overconsumption that we're seeing right now. And there's a lot of like blockchain technology that came up and people were like really excited about it because they were like, okay, if a brand like a Patagonia, for example, makes a jacket and there's like a blockchain chip in it or something, and it's on the chain and they know that, okay, Helen bought it, now Helen's going to resell it to Selina, but when Helen resells it to Selina right now on Poshmark or Depop or whatever, Helen makes all the money, Patagonia does not. But in this case, if you're able to track it, maybe the brand gets like a 10% kickback and they are rewarded for having something that can be resold and can be resold potentially at the same value, if not maybe more, and then also be rewarded for something that is high quality and can actually be resold to me and I can like then wear it and maybe I can sell it to like you, right? So it's like really important that brands now adopt and think differently about how they do their business.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that also stuck with me is the sort of perhaps tension between designing for like longevity, especially when it comes to style, trends, the fact that fashion has been so trend driven. So like how do you kind of hold those two things at the same time, if you will, especially from like a business and design perspective. And maybe it's product dependent, maybe the thing that is more trend driven, you just design it more responsibly, like so that it doesn't end up in landfill or something, you know what I mean? So, but it's just like an interesting theoretical and business kind of conundrum that's presented with this new way of doing things.
Yeah. And so it was great for them to talk about this during this panel, and there was like graphs being thrown up about like showing if a brand just continued to try to increase their profits. I think it was like 5% every year, which is kind of, I would say, kind of the bare minimum of what most brands are doing. And they like didn't do resale, like the carbon exponentially increased, whereas if they implemented some sort of resale, like it would start to dip down, which was kind of cool to see. And so they kind of left it at that, which was the part that really irked me because I was like, okay, we're bought in now, we need to like be more different with sustainable business models. And if you were a brand founder, I feel like you would have been itching to know, okay, like what do I do? Like what are my next steps? So I'll spell it out for you. Basically, you either resell or rent. And I think renting is also something that's really, really interesting and they didn't really touch on it. But again, like if you have this beautiful blouse that you're wearing and you don't want to sell it quite yet, but we almost adopt some sort of like sharing economy for the closet. We share our cars on Uber and Lyft, but our clothes a lot of the time just sit in our closet unworn. And if you could rent that out to someone else, that would be really cool. And again, if we're able to track it and brands can make money, they are incentivized to make something that's, you know, high quality, and it's like a piece of inventory almost in their arsenal that's like continuously making money out there. And if that's the case and you look at it differently, then you just like sell it and like you're done, and you know that something's going to continue to cycle in the economy and in the world. It's like a different level of thinking when it comes to design and like choosing the material and like the production process probably as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering with rent, like these sort of clothing rental companies like Rent the Runway and things like that. I need to see what reports there were about this, but I've heard from like other sustainable fashion like podcasts and stuff that those are not actually like very sustainable because of all the maintenance of the clothing that's involved. Like you have to dry clean everything and all the water and like resource waste. I don't know, just something to put out there in terms of the rental option, but like at scale. I don't know. It's all nuanced and complicated.
I mean, there's some things that are probably perfectly unsustainable and not good, but nothing's perfect, right? But it's all about figuring out what problems we're solving and how to best solve it given the current technology, current innovations, and current like budget and time constraints and resources. It's about like how you can best move forward given what you're given. And yes, for like a lot of those rental companies, like they're not really a rental company. Like Jennifer Hyman always talks about how she's actually in the dry cleaning business, and like dry cleaning is like so bad. It uses perg and like all these awful chemicals. Yeah, I mean the same could be argued about the clothes we're producing and throwing to landfill. So it really is, I think, about, if we zoom out, challenging brands to think about different forms of business when it comes to fashion and how they can continue to make money on clothes without just selling more. I think that's like the key takeaway, and having brands think differently about that and challenge how such a old industry has always performed, and really challenge the fact that there hasn't been a lot of innovation and shakeup in that regard, and maybe there should be, right? Like we really transformed the taxi industry, we really transformed the hotel industry. Like why should we not revolutionize and think differently about our clothes?
Yeah.
And so for you, what to do is really just like encouraging you to not just buy new. I really think for a lot of pieces, like you can thrift, you can shop secondhand, you can go to clothing swaps, you can even just like swap with your family and friends, and really just try to make use of what's already out there, really, and kind of incentivize brands to be able to participate in this space.
The innovation forum that we went to, which was basically like a kind of meet and greet booth situation where we could look at with different vendors, and it was sort of product vendors but also technology vendors.
Yeah.
And there was a technology vendor there who was helping brands with resale, and basically incorporating that into their website and on their business model as well. So
yeah, and I think, like I mentioned, a lot of the cool, innovative companies that we met, I want to try to get them on the podcast and have them like talk deeper, because they're clearly experts in what they're doing. And like I mentioned, there's so many different areas wrong with the fashion industry, so they've like chosen a very specific problem to go deep on, and I would love to have them on the podcast to explain it to us, and also just give us again some hope that things are actually happening. Okay, cool. So I think that's a really good discussion on like resale and how that can help decarbonize. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about is circularity. So there were a few major takeaways I had. I'll overview them, and then we can go on a little bit of a fun journey about plastic water bottles that we talked about last night. Helen had to listen to me rant about plastic water bottles for 15 minutes last night at dinner.
I mean, I agree with you, so I was predisposed to like it.
Yeah. Okay, so main takeaways. First of all, a panelist said for circularity at its truest form, it actually really shouldn't have a beginning and an end. It should just like continue in perpetuity, which I think is so true, because that's the true definition of circularity. But in this instance, we do have a beginning. The garment has like its birth, if you will. And so very, very importantly, like we were talking about in the resale discussion, you need to design with intentionality and just really have the intention that it's going to continue to be reworn, be resold, be rented, or whatever. And then at the end of life, like have something it can do and not just end up rotting away in the landfill. And then two things that were really thought-provoking for me in this conversation. So the first one is it circular or is it just simply lifetime extension?
Yeah, that was huge.
Yeah, and that was a big one because the panelists talked about how recycled plastic water bottles is a prime example of that. Like there was such a big resurgence of this back, I think like pre-COVID even, like 2019, it was like peak. Like every single athletic brand was using recycled plastic water bottle like in their leggings, in their athletic wear, and then all of a sudden all of them were like, oh yeah, we're green and we're conscious. And we're circular because we're taking waste from plastic water bottles, turning it into fabric, and then like turning it into leggings, and we're giving it new life. One could argue it's circular, but he was making a point that it's actually just pushing the lifespan, I guess, of it. It's just lifetime extension, because these plastic water bottles, yes, could have gone to the landfill, but instead now they're like in your leggings. But what happens when you're done with your leggings? And the rant I was going on yesterday with Helen is that like on surface it sounds good because you're like, okay, we're taking these recycled plastic water bottles, we're turning them into fabric, and we are like diverting them from landfill. But like I explained to you, it uses a lot of chemicals, it uses a lot of energies to actually turn it into fiber. And then not only that, studies have shown that recycled plastic water bottle, leggings, or whatever, they actually emit more microplastics than virgin. So then
which makes sense.
Yeah, which makes sense. And so that's like another thing. And then last but not least, currently with our technology and innovation, we cannot do anything with these goddamn leggings after. So it's like we really just pushed the problem down the road, which is why the lifetime extension thing was like such a mind-blowing kind of connection for me. The kind of ironic part I was talking to Helen about was like, we have so many plastic water bottles right now. Like we have finally gotten to a place where we can kind of like use the existing plastic water bottles to make new ones, and we don't have to use virgin plastic. But if we like take all these plastic water bottles and we turn them into leggings that can't be done with, and we have to make more, it's just like we're just pushing the problem down the line and creating new problems. So we really need to be more strategic. Like, guys, come on, we need to be more strategic about this.
Would you say that it's also like one of the problems with blended fabric is that it can't be, like fabric that also uses polyester, is that it can't be recycled afterwards because you can't untangle the fibers. Yeah,
exactly. Like, so something's like 80% polyester, 20% cotton. Back when I was ignorant, I was like, oh, just like take out the cotton, and like you can't do that. As of right now, you cannot. So I don't know, we'll see. Maybe in the future you can, with all the robotic thingies going on. Trademarked.
Yeah, technical term.
Yes, technical term. So that was the first one, like the circularity versus lifetime extension concept, and I loved that. And then the second thing was, you know, there's a lot of talk right now about recycled cotton, which is great. But someone brought up a really good point. It's like, okay, once we have this down and it's working and it's amazing, what happens to the cotton farmers? And I was like, this is also true. And so in an ideal world, we could equip them with new skills and they can just like do something else, but that's going to take time. That's probably going to take a decade.
Generation.
Or like decades. So unfortunately, we need to be very cognizant of that, and that's a theme throughout the entire conference around like having the right voices at the table. Just because these people aren't there doesn't mean that we don't have to factor them in, and we don't have to loop them into the plan and think about how this affects their livelihood. So it's really important to make sure we are cognizant of how one decision can then like domino affect many other decisions.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that too, I think this was because we were both at this panel, and I think a comment that was made at this panel also was kind of referencing recent EU regulations about the fact that if fabric is being made into materials and those materials are going into Europe, that fabric has to be pre-washed. And then I think the point that was being made was like, what does that, suddenly all this fabric has to be pre-washed. What does that mean for like the water quality in these communities where that process is being done? Because it has to happen on a very short time frame. And that's a kind of a similar example of, you know, well-meaning intentions, but it's going to have these literal, in this case, like downstream effects that were not considered when that decision was drafted and made. So yeah.
100%. Yeah. It's just like the policy discussion, right? Like how I was so concerned that they don't have the right people in the room. Well, like it's the exact same thing here. So I think really just stressing to people that are in these spaces, if you're ever in a position where you have the responsibility and the privilege to be doing this work, making sure that you ensure that there's diverse like thoughts and people and perspectives at the table so that there's actually inclusive policies that are being done. I know that's a very idealized view, and I can definitely be like a positive and idealistic person, but I do think that's so important. If you have the responsibility, you definitely need to do everything in your power to ensure that voices are being heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And connecting this back to the climate panel mitigation, the two panelists both were very interesting because one of them was sort of representing, I guess, like you would say like traditional factory kind of work, like the four-wall factory that we all sort of think about. And the other panelist was really addressing kind of non-traditional garment workers and people who make things from home and kind of that are not always considered when we talk about like supply chain management and things like that. So also thinking about those people and the effects that all of this will have on them, and again, including that in the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a question for you as well. So we met with a vendor who makes those items out of nets from like sea nets. What's the difference to you between that kind of system and product and the leggings made from plastic water bottles? Like, how would you distinguish, like, why does her approach work and the other approach doesn't work? to you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in this case, I don't know as much about fish nets, if I'm being honest, but I'm going to assume that fish nets, if there's like parts of it that are broken, like if there's a hole, obviously I think the net, maybe it could be repaired, but let's assume if the fish net has holes everywhere, like, I don't know, there's a sea storm or something, or like a shark, I don't know, like it can't be repaired, then the net is probably going to the landfill. And so if in that case we're then taking it and turning into fabric, like I think I'm slightly more okay with that. It's just because the plastic water bottles, it's like they only decided to do something because there was like such a big problem, and I think it was so widely covered in the media, and like plastic water bottles was just getting a lot of hate, so then they were like, let's turn it into fabric and like make it seem like we're doing something, whereas
Makes
in this
great marketing.
exactly and so I think in this case it's like, yes, if like the fish nets are, you know, I'm not an expert at this. I think it's important to have that podcast have them on the podcast. But I think if we can take something that is truly going to landfill and make a new life out of it and do it in a way where there's not a lot of chemicals, it doesn't use a lot of energy, and it doesn't have like, you know, impact, then I think that's something that I can get behind. So it's really about, I guess, twofold, like it's not like actually diverting from landfill and not just like pushing it down the road, and then like doing it in a way that is not harmful. So I think it'll be really exciting to get them on the podcast and get their thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So closing this out, you might be like, okay, what do I do? Don't buy something because it's made out of recycled plastic water bottles. That's number one. So don't just buy it because you feel like it's cute and you feel good about yourself. Only buy it if it's like something you actually really need. And then, yeah, just in general, like really think about if it's actually going to be used and loved on your end. And then finally, the last panel we wanted to talk about was around Indigenous practices and perspectives. And this was one of, like, I would say one of my favorite panels, and it was the last one of the day. So at that point we were like quite exhausted, and it was actually a very like energizing panel to be a part of. So it was a great last panel for the day. And there was a lot of great things here. I think on that panel there was like two, and I think both of them had really great perspectives to bring. And as someone that is from a country that has, like, I'm originally from Canada, and we've had such deeply traumatic Indigenous histories and things that have happened, I've known that Indigenous people have really beautiful practices, and they were basically the OG sustainable like people. Like, they did sustainability before it was a thing. They always took care of the land. They always made sure they didn't take more than they could like allow it to foster and prosper, because they very much so lived off their land. And I think it's a very beautiful practice, and they've always been intentional about their resources from day one. And both of them were talking about how you can take these ancient practices and be inspired by them and almost reuse them and like think about them today. Like, one of the examples was done by, I think her name was Tracy, and she was talking about this example of the three sisters where it was like three different materials, and I am going to chase her down and get her on the podcast to talk about it, because I'm not going to do it justice. But
she's a Dene, a Navajo shoe designer.
It was so cool, and she was talking about how you can like use these principles to design the shoes. And then in the same regard though, obviously we've seen a lot of brands like culturally appropriate and take Indigenous intellectual property, and that's obviously not good. So I want to bring her on to talk about how brands can take inspiration from them with consent and do it in a way where it's still respectful, and then also do it in a way where like the Indigenous people, if they want to, not that it's their responsibility, but if they want to, they can like share these practices that they've been doing since day one. And like there was a really big call to action. Like, this is one of the panels that had a very clear call to action around brands and like people needing to reach out, talk to them if they're like willing to share, because again, it's not their responsibility, and like really build relationships and to stop playing telephone and just like talk to them. And the thing too that really breaks my heart is that Indigenous people have been taking care of the planet and trying to preserve it as much as they can from day one, but they're more often than not the ones that are actually being displaced in these types of situations, and they're seeing the effects of climate change, which is so unfair and so unjust. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to really flag, and this is something that really reinvigorated kind of my passion on the work we do. And I think brings to light that we need to amplify these types of messages and have them on the podcast, which I'm like really excited about, but then also have these difficult discussions around how brands can learn from them, but in a way that's like respectful and responsible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was really impressed that they had this panel at all, because I could easily see Indigenous creators and designers being overlooked. I mean,
totally.
Yeah. So I think the fact that they were there at all was really like a great thing. And yeah, it was very inspiring. Tracy did not mince words. She was very much like, you need to work with us, or like, you know, and you act and we can do it, you know. I thought it was really inspiring, and yeah, I would love to have her on the podcast.
And then to round out the discussion, did you want to talk about your scarf example?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will start off by saying that I am not Indigenous. As from a young age, I've always been interested in like history and material culture, and especially like Indigenous history and material culture, and that I credit sort of learning about the history of different Indigenous people in North America as sort of starting my creative like fashion and sewing journey. So I feel like I owe a lot to those communities. But there's also, you know, obviously I'm also a trained anthropologist, so there's also a lot of thought that goes on in my head about how do we honor history and be respectful and like not culturally appropriate. And so, for example, there's this designer, Bethany Yellowtail. She's Crow and Cheyenne, and she has this amazing brand creating vintage or indigenously inspired women's wear. Like, so she uses a lot of traditional Indigenous designs, but with modern silhouettes. And for example, if you know the history of especially like 19th century clothing of those Indigenous tribes, you'll know that it's common to use elk teeth as like a way of adorning women's dresses. And she has taken that design motif and turned it into like a print for scarves and dresses. And so if you look at that, you know the history, it just adds this whole layer to like the depth of what she's doing. And so I really like her stuff, but I had this sort of quandary of like, can I, as a non-Indigenous person, like, you know, buy her things? Like, is that like sort of okay, or is it culturally appropriating? Like, how do I navigate this? I did in the end like end up buying one of her pieces, and I love it, one of her scarves. But it is, I think, a question to be like considered, and wanting to be respectful, but also wanting to support. So I don't have a clear answer, but that's just an example of a great designer that you should check out. So we can link her down below, perhaps.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a case-by-case basis, and if you're ever in doubt, like just ask them. I'm sure they would appreciate being asked versus feeling, you know, like they've been appropriated after the fact. So just like ask people. I think they're willing to have these conversations, and sometimes we can feel afraid to even ask or have these conversations, but I really think that you shouldn't be. So yeah, I highly encourage you to just ask. I feel like in these kind of scenarios where people are taking their culture and they're putting it into something and being creative and turning it into something so beautiful, I would assume that they would like to be supported. So I think that like you're definitely asking the right questions, and brands and all of us in general need to ask more questions, but also just like be curious and actually be willing to have these conversations with people, and don't shy away from them, and don't be scared about them.
Having these hard conversations about like history and allyship too, that need to happen in many different areas. But yeah, I think it's also incorporating that. And sometimes I worry that like maybe we put all Indigenous people into like one big box, whereas in reality there's a lot of like differences and like all of these things. So there's just a ton of nuance with all of the things that we're talking about today. But I think if you're interested in learning more and you're in the US, especially on the East Coast, there's the National Museum of the American Indian, which is it has great exhibits, and they work closely with Indigenous communities. They frequently, I think in DC, have like arts fairs and sort of cultural exhibitions going on there. There's a museum in DC as well as in New York, so definitely a good resource if you're in the area.
And then in terms of what to do, Helen talked about some of it already, but just like continue to educate yourself about Indigenous culture and practices, and we will have some more voices hopefully on our podcast, which will be really exciting. And then just like encourage brands you shop from to reach out and hear these voices if they are, you know, willing to share. And then just continue to ask questions and participate in these discussions, and don't shy away from them. So yeah, I want to wrap up. This is probably a really long video, so if you're watching until now, like you're a real one.
Comment below.
Yeah, let us know. I really wanted this to be a two-sided discussion like we talked about. So if you haven't already joined the Sustainable Fashionpreneurs or TSF, please do so. The link is recloseted.com/TSF. It will be on the screen in the description for you, but you really need to think critically about this. Like Helen mentioned, sustainability and all these topics is so nuanced, and we need to stop thinking of things in black and white. There's a lot of gray here, and I want to talk about it with all of you, and like I'm sure Helen would love to talk about it with you too. And so yeah, just to wrap up, if you have any questions or anything you want us to discuss further, or even people you want us to have on the podcast, then tell us in TSF. And then did you want to wrap up with that quick note about like preaching to the choir?
Yeah, I guess so. For me, again, coming to this conference for the first time, I had some thoughts about like, you know, it was impressive to see all the players that were at this conference and at this sort of metaphorical and literal table in some ways, but also wondering who is not at this table, and essentially, you know, to what extent, even though events like, you know, obviously events like this are valuable, but are we sort of preaching to the choir? Because people who are sort of, I feel like in a way, it's kind of a self-selecting situation where the people who already believe in this mission are going to show up. So I think, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's worth throwing that in there.
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about this at dinner last night around how people generally flock to things where they feel comfortable. So if a brand doesn't have their sustainability strategy figured out, and it's a really big fast fashion brand, and they show up at a conference like this, they're probably getting heckled.
You mean Shein's not going to show up next year? Like,
I don't know, maybe they'll be like a principal sponsor, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, but yeah, like they're probably gonna be heckled, and it's probably uncomfortable for them, but like every single person and every single brand has had to take that uncomfortable first step. So it's really about having the courage to take that step and show up, even if you know you're gonna be heckled, or even if you know you're not doing anything and you're doing a lot of bad things. It's like having the courage to stop doing that and show up and participate. So going back to my very original point around how it was so heartwarming just to be in the room, because there's so many people that genuinely care about this and it's doing so much amazing work. To your point too, like we need to have other people that maybe aren't doing as much stuff and maybe not as educated or have a lot of excuses around why they're not doing it at this table too. So hopefully we see that change. Yeah, and it's not like a reflection on any part of like GFA not being inclusive. I think it's just like, you have to be proactive and like attend these things, you know, so yeah,
absolutely.
Totally. So to wrap up, GFA, thank you so much for having us. It was so much fun. We both had so many amazing takeaways, and we hope that for folks that weren't able to attend, you have learned some items. And if you are actually curious about the specific panels that we have talked about, I will leave a link on how you can actually watch the recordings. Like Helen mentioned, it's such a well-produced event, and I'm sure the recordings, like we saw the ones from Copenhagen this year because we weren't able to attend, and you feel like you're there. So if you feel like you missed out and you want to watch the panels, you can check out the link below. But yeah, thank you so much, GFA, for having us, and thank you, Helen, for coming on. This is such a great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Awesome, that was great.